My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 38 years old. I've spent the last 12 years working as a fraud and threat analyst for a regional bank's cybersecurity division, which means my entire career is built on one specific instinct. When something looks almost, but not quite, like the real thing, you don't relax until you understand exactly what's wrong with it. That instinct is the only reason my mother still has her house. At her 73rd birthday dinner, in front of 11 relatives, my brother Marcus set down his fork and said, "Mom doesn't need you scaring her with your conspiracy theories, Nora. Not everything's a hacking plot. You've got everyone on edge over nothing." The table laughed, softly. The specific laugh people use when they've collectively decided a person is being difficult. My mother laughed too, a little embarrassed, patting my hand like I was a worried child who needed comforting rather than believing. I didn't argue. I did the thing I do at work when an alert looks like a false positive right up until the moment it isn't. I didn't push. I just kept watching. Because what none of them knew, sitting around that table with a half-eaten birthday cake between us, was that 6 weeks later, a voice that sounded exactly like my nephew Jake, down to the specific catch in his laugh, was going to call my mother's landline and very nearly cost her $42,000. And I was going to be the only person in this family who could prove, definitively, that it hadn't actually been him. If you've ever been the one who noticed something wrong before anyone else was willing to believe you, stay with me to the end, because this one has a piece of evidence in it that changes how you'll think about every phone call from someone you love. Subscribe and drop the word proof in the comments right now, before we even begin. Let's go back to the beginning, because you need the full shape of what actually happened before that birthday dinner and what happened after to understand exactly what was at stake. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood outside Pittsburgh, the middle child of three. My older brother Marcus, me, and my younger sister Paige. My father worked in freight logistics for 30 years. My mother, Constance, everyone calls her Connie, taught middle school science until she retired. It was a warm, ordinary family in most respects. And I don't want to paint my siblings as villains from the outset, because that's not actually the shape of this story. What it is, at its core, is a story about the specific, modern gap between people who understand how digital fraud actually works in 2026 and people who still, understandably, think of scams the way their own parents once described them. A stranger on the phone with a bad story and an obvious accent, easy to spot, easy to hang up on. I went into cybersecurity almost by accident, starting in general IT support after a computer science degree, drifting into fraud detection because I turned out to have a specific talent for it. The same talent, I think, that made me a slightly difficult child growing up. The kid who noticed when a story didn't quite add up, who asked one more question than anyone wanted answered. My mother used to call it my detective streak, fondly, when I was young. It became something else, somewhere along the way, once I was an adult raising real concerns about real things. Less a charming trait, more a source of quiet, recurring family friction. Marcus lives 20 minutes from my mother and has, for the last several years, functioned as her primary point of contact for anything logistical. Bills, appointments, the small daily maintenance of an aging parent's life. Paige lives out of state, visits a few times a year, warm and present in the specific way people are warm and present when the actual granular, difficult labor of care happens to fall on somebody else. I live 40 minutes away, close enough to visit regularly, far enough that I've never been the default sibling for day-to-day logistics, a role Marcus has held for years, and one that I think, without either of us ever naming it directly, shaped a great deal of how my later concerns got received. I want to be specific about something because it matters for understanding what happened. I work directly, professionally, with fraud patterns targeting exactly the demographic my mother belongs to. Adults over 70, often recently widowed or living alone, often trusting in ways that made an earlier generation of scams both crueler and, in some ways, easier to spot. What I'd been watching develop over the past 2 years, in my actual job, wasn't the old, familiar scam architecture at all. It was something newer, faster moving, and significantly harder to recognize by instinct alone. The rise of AI voice cloning, technology that can now reconstruct a convincing replica of a specific person's voice from as little as 10 or 15 seconds of audio, often lifted directly from a public social media video. I'd flagged 3 cases at my own bank in the preceding 6 months, all following the same emerging pattern. An elderly account holder receiving a call from what sounded, unmistakably, like a grandchild or adult child in urgent distress. A car accident, an arrest, a medical emergency requiring immediate, untraceable payment. In every case, the voice had been cloned from publicly available video, usually a graduation, a wedding toast, a birthday post, anything with a clear enough audio sample. I brought this up at a family dinner 8 months before my mother's birthday, not as an abstract warning, but specifically, directly, because I wanted my family prepared. I remember the exact dinner where I first raised it, because I remember exactly how it landed. We were at Marcus's house, a casual Sunday gathering, and I explained, as clearly and calmly as I could, what I was seeing at work. That scammers could now clone a familiar voice convincingly enough to fool even a close family member over the phone, and that I wanted us, as a family, to set up something simple, a private verification phrase, something none of us would ever say publicly, that we could use to confirm identity if any of us ever received an urgent, distressing call asking for money. Marcus laughed, not unkindly, but dismissively. That sounds like something out of a movie, Nora. Nobody's going to bother cloning our voices. We're not exactly high-value targets. Paige, on the phone from out of state, agreed, gently teasing me for always finding the next thing to worry about. My mother, characteristically, tried to smooth the moment over. "I think it's sweet that you want to protect us, honey," she said, in the tone she'd used my whole life for concerns she'd already privately decided were overblown. "But I think we'll be all right." I let it go that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I didn't push it into a fight. I simply filed it away, the way I file away most concerns that don't get immediate traction, and I quietly set up the verification phrase for myself and my own household anyway, telling my mother and siblings the phrase even though none of them took it especially seriously. Over the following months, I noticed smaller things that, individually, seemed insignificant, but that I logged, out of professional habit, the way you log low-severity alerts that might someday cluster into something meaningful. My mother mentioned, once, receiving a strange call that turned out, she assumed, to be a wrong number. She mentioned, another time, a small, unusual transfer from her savings account. $600, gone to cover what she described, vaguely, as a mix-up with Jake's car insurance, referring to my nephew, Marcus's 22-year-old son, who was away at college 3 states over. I asked my mother directly about the $600. She said Jake had called, upset, said his insurance had lapsed and he needed to cover a payment before his coverage was canceled entirely, and that she'd sent it through a payment app because he said it was faster than a bank transfer. I asked if she'd verified it was actually him. She said, a little defensively, "Of course it was him, Nora. I know my own grandson's voice." I called Jake directly that same evening. He had no idea what I was talking about. His insurance was current. He hadn't called his grandmother in over 3 weeks. I want to walk you through what I did next carefully, because I think the process matters as much as the conclusion. I didn't confront my mother immediately with alarm. I've learned, both professionally and personally, that frightening an elderly person about fraud can sometimes do almost as much damage as the fraud itself, making them anxious and isolated rather than appropriately cautious. Instead, I asked her, gently, if she still had the number the call had come from. She did, saved in her phone under Jake's cell, though the actual number, when I checked it against my nephew's real number, was different by 2 digits. A spoofed number, close enough to pass a glance, different enough to be, on inspection, obviously fraudulent. I pulled the transaction record from her payment app. The $600 had gone to an account under a name that wasn't Jake's, routed, based on patterns I recognized immediately from my own work, through a chain that strongly suggested a coordinated scam operation rather than an isolated bad actor. I brought this to my mother clearly, gently, showing her exactly what I'd found. She was shaken, understandably, and for the first time, genuinely worried rather than dismissive. I raised it with Marcus and Paige again, this time with actual evidence in hand rather than an abstract warning. And this is the part of the story I still find hardest to fully explain, even now, because it reveals something about how families sometimes process uncomfortable information that has very little to do with the actual facts on the table. Marcus's response wasn't to focus on the evidence. It was to focus on me. You're going to scare her into thinking every call is a scam, he said. She's 72, Nora, not senile. You can't wrap her in bubble wrap because you spend all day looking at fraud cases at work. This is exactly the kind of thing you do. You find a problem and you blow it up into a whole crisis. I tried to explain that $600 sent to a spoofed number wasn't a hypothetical crisis. It was a documented one that had already happened. Paige, on the phone, suggested, not unkindly but firmly, that maybe I should let Mom handle her own finances without turning every little thing into an investigation. My mother, caught between us, ultimately sided, gently, with her other two children. Not because she disagreed with the facts exactly, I think, but because being the center of a family disagreement was its own kind of distressing, and smoothing things over had always been her instinct, going back to my own childhood. I let it go. Again. I want to be honest about how much that cost me, because I think it's important. Not out of self-pity, but because I think it explains exactly why, 6 weeks later, when the actual, larger attack came, I had already quietly decided I wasn't going to let it go a third time, whatever the family cost turned out to be. My mother's 73rd birthday dinner happened at a restaurant Marcus had booked, 11 of us around a long table. My mother, Marcus, and his wife, Paige in from out of state for the occasion, Jake home from college for the weekend, several aunts and uncles, the ordinary warm chaos of a family celebration. The conversation drifted, at one point, toward a minor incident from earlier that week. My mother had mentioned, in passing, receiving another strange call. This one, she said, quickly resolved once she recognized it wasn't legitimate. I asked, gently, for details, wanting to understand the pattern rather than dismiss it. And that's when Marcus, mid-meal, set down his fork and delivered the line that opens this story. Mom doesn't need you scaring her with your conspiracy theories, Nora. Not everything's a hacking plot. You've got everyone on edge over nothing. The table laughed. My mother patted my hand, a little embarrassed on my behalf. The specific embarrassment of a parent watching one child be gently corrected by another in front of company. I felt the whole weight of 8 months of being right, quietly, and unheard, settle into that single moment, and I did the thing I do at work when a genuine threat gets waved off as a false alarm. I didn't argue. I let the table move on to other conversation. I finished my dinner. I hugged my mother goodbye. And I went home and did what I always do when something doesn't sit right. I kept watching. Comment the word proof right now if you've ever been made the difficult one for noticing something everyone else preferred not to see. Because that's the exact moment this story turns. 6 weeks after that birthday dinner, at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, my mother's landline rang. The voice on the other end, according to what she later described to me in careful, shaken detail, sounded exactly like Jake. The same slight rasp in his laugh, the same specific way he says, grandma, instead of grandmother. Details a stranger reading from a script couldn't have faked, but details an AI model trained on 15 seconds of publicly posted graduation video audio absolutely could. The voice told her he'd been in a car accident, that he wasn't hurt badly, but the other driver was pressing charges, and he'd been arrested, and he needed $42,000 for bail and to cover the other driver's medical costs before things got worse, and that he was too embarrassed and scared to call his own parents. And please, please, Grandma, don't tell Mom and Dad yet. I'll explain everything once this is handled. I just need you to wire it today. My mother, terrified, began the process of authorizing a wire transfer from her savings account. The actual, real $42,000, nearly a third of her total retirement savings. She got as far as calling her bank to confirm the transfer amount before some small, flickering instinct, made her pause. She told me, later, that it was the verification phrase. The one I'd insisted on setting up 8 months earlier, the one Marcus had called something out of a movie. She'd asked the voice on the phone, almost apologetically, just say the word, sweetheart, the one Aunt Nora set up. And the voice on the other end had gone quiet for a half-second too long, then said, Grandma, I don't have time for this. Please, I need the money now. And something about that specific evasion, small as it was was enough to make her hang up and call me instead of the bank. I want you to understand what happened over the next 90 minutes, because it's the entire reason this story ends the way it does. I confirmed, within minutes, using tools I use every day at work, that the incoming call had originated from a spoofed number registered through a voice-over IP service commonly associated with international scam operations. The same infrastructure, in fact, behind 2 of the 3 cases I'd flagged professionally 8 months earlier. I called my actual nephew, Jake, who was in a college lecture hall 400 miles away, entirely unharmed, deeply confused, and immediately horrified once I explained what had happened. I called my mother's bank directly, using my professional credentials to escalate the fraud flag, and had the transfer frozen before it processed. $42,000. One phone call. 90 minutes between my mother almost losing nearly a third of her retirement savings and the moment I stopped it, entirely because of a verification phrase my own family had laughed off 8 months earlier as paranoid. I called a family meeting myself, 3 days later, at my mother's house. Not out of a desire for vindication exactly, though I won't pretend that impulse wasn't somewhere in the mix, but because I genuinely believed this family needed, urgently, to understand what had actually happened and what nearly happened in specific, undeniable terms. Marcus arrived defensive before I'd said a single word, which told me, more than anything else, that some part of him already understood what was coming. I laid it out plainly, the way I would in a professional incident report. The spoofed number, the voice cloning technology, the specific origin of the 15-second audio sample the scammers had almost certainly pulled from Jake's own graduation video, posted publicly 18 months earlier, and still, as of that morning, sitting unrestricted on social media. I showed the bank's fraud escalation report. I showed the frozen transaction. I let Jake, sitting quietly beside me, confirm directly that he had never made that call. Marcus was quiet for a long time after I finished, longer than I expected. Then he said, "I called it a conspiracy theory in front of everyone, at her birthday." His voice cracked slightly on the word birthday, and I understood, watching him, that he wasn't really apologizing to me in that moment. He was reckoning, in real time, with how close his own dismissiveness had come to costing his mother a third of her savings, and with the specific, uncomfortable fact that being wrong, here, hadn't been a small, harmless miscalculation. It had nearly been catastrophic. My mother reached over and took my hand, the same gesture she'd used at the birthday dinner to gently pat away my concern, except this time it meant something entirely different. "I should have listened to you 8 months ago," she said. "I think some part of me didn't want to believe the world had actually changed that much. It felt easier to believe you were just being careful the way you've always been careful, rather than believe someone could actually sound exactly like Jake and not be him." I told her, honestly, that I understood that instinct completely, because it's the same instinct that makes this particular kind of fraud so devastating. It doesn't ask you to trust a stranger. It asks you to trust the people you already, completely trust, using a voice engineered specifically to exploit that trust. I want to be honest about something before I close this out, because I think it matters for anyone listening who's in a similar position with their own family. This story isn't really about being right, or about the specific satisfaction of proving a skeptical sibling wrong. What it's actually about is the enormous, often invisible cost of a family's collective instinct to protect its own comfort by dismissing the person raising an inconvenient warning. And how, in this particular kind of modern fraud, that instinct isn't just socially uncomfortable anymore. It's genuinely dangerous. In the months since, our family made real, concrete changes, not just apologies. We set up formal verification phrases for every member of the family, updated periodically, never posted or discussed anywhere digital. Jake took down the public graduation video and made his social media accounts private once he understood exactly how a 15-second clip of his own voice had nearly cost his grandmother her retirement. I gave an informal presentation, at Marcus's request, at his own workplace, walking his colleagues through exactly what I do professionally, because he told me, afterward, that he wanted people who worked with him to understand what he'd almost let happen to his own mother out of simple, well-meaning disbelief. My mother is safe. Her savings are intact. And something has genuinely shifted in how this family receives the things I notice. Not because I finally proved myself, which was never the actual goal, but because everyone in this family now understands, at a level that's no longer abstract, exactly what it costs to dismiss a warning, simply because it's inconvenient or unfamiliar. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you've ever been the one in your family who notices things nobody else wants to look at closely, being right isn't always comfortable, and it will not always be received kindly, especially the first several times. But love, sometimes, looks exactly like being the person willing to be laughed at across a birthday dinner table, quietly, patiently, until the moment finally comes when being right actually matters. Comment the word proof one more time if you made it all the way to the end. I want to know exactly who stayed with me for this whole story. Subscribe to Pieces of Us. My family called me paranoid about mom's scam calls. 6 weeks later, I proved exactly who wasn't on the other end of that phone, and exactly what it would have cost if nobody had been listening.